Hi, thank you for coming. So this is entitled up there, What Can I Do About Climate Change? And more popularly known as a non-depressing talk on climate change. Why is it entitled that? This talk starts from the assumption that you all already know something about the science of climate change, that you already understand that we have a problem, and that's why you came. So there will be no drowning polar bears in this talk. What I am going to talk about is the solutions that are available to us, a little bit about why we as a country seem to be living in misinformation land, and then actions that are happening right now that you can get involved in and things that you can do about climate change. So this first slide is about efficiencies and abatement, and is part of the solution before us. Efficiencies and abatement mean that machines, buildings, or equipments can be made more efficient. Right now, the way we make things, there's a tremendous amount of energy that is wasted by the equipment that we have. And this McKinsey curve here shows the cost of carbon savings. So all of the abatements pay for themselves. That's the part below the axis in the picture. The ones above the axes are new technologies or alternative energies, and they do cost money. But the sort of good news here is that a lot of the solution pays for itself. And since paying for this is an issue, that's kind of good to know. Amory Lovins, a nationally known environmental engineer, says that we can get to 350 parts per million carbon, which is the safe level, by having these 6% improvements in efficiencies. If we did that in this country, and if China did 8% efficiencies in their country. So as we're building new things, it means that the new things need to be built with these efficiencies, and that as we, in our businesses, homes, churches, and organizations make decisions, that we have to be building that into the decisions that we make. Transportation makes up a little less than a third of the U.S. total carbon output. Most of the energy is used by cars, is used to move the weight of the car. Car companies are now designing cars made out of composite, which makes it the same size, but 1/3 of the weight of current cars. And that means that they can have better mileage and less energy to be built in the first place. Lighter means that smaller batteries are needed. This also means that the plug-in revolution becomes much more possible, that we can actually get to a situation where we use solar power to fuel our cars, essentially. This is a solar car designed by the Palestinians in order to avoid buying Israeli oil. Planes are one of the hugest contributors to our individual carbon footprint. Your carbon footprint means the carbon that you personally use in a year to support your way of life. Planes use about 1 pound of carbon per every mile that you travel. So for most people, if you do travel by plane, it's one of the biggest contributors there is to your carbon footprint. So the good news about planes is that they also can be designed with this lighter composite material. We have basically yet to start designing energy efficient engines for them. They still have very old style engines. They would have to be fueled with biofuel, and when I say that, I do mean the non-food kind of biofuel. There is things like swishgrass, because there's a lot of issues with taking food and turning it into energy and leaving people starving. Buildings are roughly 1/3 of the energy that the U.S. consumes. One of the biggest savings in carbons is integrative design. So the heat created by the use of electricity is used for heating the building. Integrative design also makes use of passive solar and other design features in order to use less energy. Amory Lovins himself lives in a very large, huge house in Colorado, which despite the cold winters there, he pays nothing for heat or energy, and his house actually feeds energy back into the energy grid. This picture that you're looking at here is a skyscraper named Pearl River Tower in China that was designed to have a zero carbon footprint due to integrative design. So that whole skyscraper has a zero footprint. The Bullitt Foundation here in Seattle opened its model carbon neutral building in April of last year. Britain is requiring that all of its new buildings be carbon neutral by the year 2016. The Empire State Building was retrofitted in a way to save 1/3 of its current energy. And part of how this was done was one of the floors of the building, vacant floor, was taken to make a factory in which they manufactured everything that they needed for the retrofit, so they didn't have to transport the parts to the site. So that's sort of an example of the kind of creativity that can be employed in order to do things in a more energy efficient way. You've probably heard people say that we may have to use nuclear or clean coal, sort of double speak, because they say there's no way that alternative energies can get us where we need to go. In fact, already without subsidies, incredible leaps have been made in alternative energies. If we were to take the subsidies that we currently give to carbon and to coal and oil and give them to alternatives, we would be able to move them forward at a much faster rate than they currently are doing. This graph shows how we could get to carbon neutral with energy alternatives by 2050. Lovins estimates that alternative energies can produce 22 times the current amount of power produced by coal. He goes on to say that nuclear is not proceeding at a pace that will even replace the existing nuclear power plants, and this is probably even more true after Fukushima. Scientists estimate that more than 40% of the excessive CO2 that we have in the air has accumulated from the deforestation that we've done in the past centuries. We can make a huge difference simply by planting trees. Each one is considered to use approximately 25 pounds of carbon a year, and trees sequester carbon over their lifetime in a bell curve, so towards the end of their life they don't absorb as much. So this means that they can still be harvested, but good policy would suggest that we do that towards the end of their life. In China, in 1981, their Congress declared that all citizens above the age of 11 have the duty to plant 3 trees a year. As a result, in 2008, they planted 11.7 million acres of forest that year. Plant for the Planet is an international program run by children. There's one here in Seattle, the father of whom is sitting in the audience right now. And they have been determining how many trees will need to be planted in order to soak up the carbon that we need to soak up. And so they've done that also by state. So here in Washington, they've estimated that we need to plant 1 billion trees, and that breaks down to 150 for each of us. So I'd like you all to please get started on your allotment of 150 trees. And these kids get trained in being able to talk about these issues, and they have talked to City Council, the new mayor, and the governor. And that's one of them right there, talking at our Draw the Line event. Climate change is a large problem. However, if we work effectively on even one part of it, we can make a difference. We do not need to stick our heads in the sand or feel overwhelmed. One of the reasons it's hard to take action against climate change is that as individuals, we think that the problem is way bigger than us, that we don't have the power or the control over all the factors. This is one reason why it helps to join with other people in taking action. We might even, as it suggests here, wind up making a better world. If you take no other point from this presentation, I would like you to take away the idea that we have all the technological and social solutions that we need to solve climate change. What we lack is the political will, and you have to be part of the solution of developing that political will. Public awareness about climate change is a very real problem. At Yale and George Mason, they have been doing an ongoing study on public opinion about climate change since 2008. In 2007, before the study started, due to the influence of the movie An Inconvenient Truth, was the highest year of belief in our country in the reality of climate change. Here you can show that by 2008, there was still a pretty high belief, and in the fall of 2012, it was almost at that same level, but sadly, we are flagging again. Among the 63% of Americans who are concerned about climate change, only 15% are very worried, and 38% are somewhat worried. Other studies show that it takes 20% of the population to be active on a concern in order for change to take place. So I invite you to join me in moving the other 5% of the population into understanding the severity of the situation. Only 42% of Americans believe that scientists agree on climate change as human-made and severe. So I'm going to ask members of the audience here to just shout out what you think, and Michael doesn't get to answer this, are the percentage of scientists who actually do agree that climate change is human-made. We have a very well-educated audience here, 97% in peer-reviewed studies. Another study done at Drexel shows that extreme weather events such as war, unemployment, oil prices, science education, activism, none of this affects public opinion or media coverage. The media responds to political battles or elite cues, meaning famous people. So if any of you know any famous people, please talk to me afterwards about that. Therefore, when a political battle does take place about climate change, regardless of the outcome, it raises public awareness about it. So the Democrats have had a strategy of not trying to bring bills to Congress on climate change unless they think they can win. I think this is a wrong strategy. We need to be doing it anyway, because win, lose, or draw, more people will understand about climate change. This has become an increasingly polarized debate between Republicans and Democrats. I know this is counterintuitive to those of you who believe that science should be the thing that guides our thinking about climate change. But back in the Clinton years, 2/3 of both Democrats and Republicans believed in climate change. Now we have 9/10 of Democrats believe in it and only 3/10 of Republicans. But why? Some of the answers can be found, didn't want to go there yet. Some of the answers can be found in the work of Jonathan Haidt, a psychologist, or George Lakoff, a linguist. Both see that the two parties have very different value systems, and how we have framed the issue of climate change speaks to the Democratic frame, but it does not speak to the Republican frame. However, another part of the answer to this is the very well-funded misinformation campaign that the Koch brothers and the oil cartels have been funding. Since the 70s, they have funded research studies and 12 different think tanks which have produced scientific studies, not peer-reviewed ones, that are the basis of climate denial. They have made sure that those studies go to the media, the courts, are cited in court cases, cited by politicians and pundits. It does not help that the current media's idea of balanced reporting is that you report two sides of every story, even if one side represents 3% of science. Perhaps the most interesting answer comes from Naomi Klein's article, Capitalism versus Climate, in the November 2011 issue of Nation magazine. Here she reports on attending a climate hoax conference sponsored by one of the Koch brothers foundations. She reports on various aspects of the conference, but concludes that perhaps the far right has grasped one of the key implications of climate change more, in fact, than most Americans. We cannot keep living the lifestyle that we are living. Radical change will be required. And they have grasped that that is a threat to capitalism as we know it. In fact, they believe that the secret agenda of the left is about climate change because of its ability to destroy capitalism. So suddenly it sort of makes sense about the red-blue split. However, despite this somewhat bad news about how politicized and polarized the country has become on this issue, there is some good news in the Yale study. Here you can see, when asked, how much do you support or oppose regulating carbon dioxide, the primary greenhouse gas, as a pollutant, that the vast majority of Democrats and 77% of independents and 67% of Republicans favored this. This is the rank and file average people of every party. Despite the party bias, when just asked about whether they favored certain policies, almost everyone in both parties favor placing a high priority on developing clean energy alternatives. In this graph, you can see how the majority of people feel about each of these possibilities, the blue being favoring it and the red or orange being opposing it. The first one is funding renewable energy. That's the most popular. The second one, providing tax rebates for efficiencies, cars, and solar panels. The third one, regulating CO2 as a pollutant. This one was a surprise for me because this is what lost in Congress earlier, and yet still it's that popular. Expanding offshore drilling. This is environmentally actually a very bad idea, but this is nonetheless what ranks fourth among Americans. 5, requiring utilities to produce 20% of clean energy. 6, signing international treaties to cut emissions. The good news here is that the majority of Americans do support this. The bad news is that it comes 6th because it's actually a very important part of what would be solutions for us. And then the last 2, eliminating all federal energy subsidies, which would eliminate for coal and oil, and then nuclear power. So how do we personally make a difference? You have undoubtedly heard arguments by people before about whether individual choices can make a difference. Does solving a Prius really help, etc.? There is no way that we can get to lower carbon emissions without Americans changing our lifestyle, because we consume so much more energy than other countries on a per capita basis. In this slide, the U.S. is the blue on the bottom. China is the purple. They have surpassed us in terms of absolute carbon value, but if you consider that they manufacture most of our consumable goods, I think we fairly would have to say that a good portion of their climate footprint is really our climate footprint. And the purple strip above the U.S. is misleading because it is all of Europe combined. So that's pretty shocking when you think that all those countries combine to that level. Things will be different 20 years from now, no matter what we do. The Yale study shows that only 39% of Americans recognize that we have already harmed the earth, and only 39% believe that they personally will be affected. The truth is that we have already changed the earth permanently, and everyone living will feel its effects. We have until 2020 to make a significant difference, or we will invoke tipping points in nature that will set off a chain of irreversible effects. The time for change is now. This, by the way, is the depressing slide in this. We will have to live in healthier ways. What I see is that we will be eating more locally grown and healthier foods, collaborating more with friends and neighbors, walking and biking more while improving our health, living in generally more sustainable, earth-friendly way. And depending on how we go about this, we can either position our society now to make good choices, or we can lock in bad outcomes. The longer we wait, the more severe the changes that we face, and the more options we take off the table. So I'm going to have Rich pass out a handout. right now. This handout has on it the same carbon calculator that's listed on the top of here. And I encourage you to actually calculate what your carbon footprint is. We don't really know until we do it. I always thought of myself as a very earth-friendly person who would have a low carbon footprint, but I didn't know about the flying part. And when I was married, my family had a very embarrassingly high carbon footprint. So we know that changing light bulbs makes a small impact, but on this handout it lists many different things having varying impacts. And so, you know, one person's sacrifice is another person's joy. Some of us may not be into giving up hot showers, but are delighted to hang out the laundry with the birds chirping nearby, and vice versa. So, you know, you have to have that conversation with your family and figure out what you're willing to do. But one of our greatest impacts come when we organize with other people. There are lots of opportunities within your own workplace. If you work in a corporation, a small shop, or an office, you can apply a lot of these same carbon-saving ideas to your workplaces. You can talk with people in your professional organizations, in your churches, civic groups. There are lots of places to try to work on changing this because it's all part of what's going to happen in the long run. I think our greatest impact comes when we join with other people. I'm the coordinator locally of Seattle 350. 350 is an international organization which takes its name after the parts per million that we can safely have without raising the Earth's temperature by 2 degrees, which is what scientists have agreed would be unsafe. And in fact, they're now starting to say it's a little bit less than 2 degrees. 350 takes a leave it in the ground approach, and what that means is that the fossil fuel companies have 5 times the reserves in the ground than what we can safely burn and stay at that level of 350. And so we're trying to take actions that encourage that to be left in the ground and not extracted and burned. We have our own chapter here which started last May. This is a list of the work groups that we have. We have meetings once a month on the first Wednesday of every month at University Friends meeting. So you just missed the February meeting, but there are opportunities in March. Nationally, 350 has fought to stop the XL pipeline, which is designed to transport dirty tar sands from Alberta, BC to the Gulf of Mexico for export. We have fought to stop this because, as you can see in this picture, the extracting of this deep, heavy tar sands from the environment is a disaster. It also burns with a heavier carbon load than regular oil, and this has caused James Hansen, the sort of premier climate scientist, to call it game over for the planet if we proceed with it. XL's political fate changes almost weekly, which is sort of an amusing statement to be making today, since the previous Friday, the State Department came out with its environmental impact statement, and this is the second environmental impact statement that they've made on it, and it's just as flawed as the previous one that they made on it. They got contractors to work on the statement who, as it turns out, are subcontractors for the companies who are building the pipeline. So there's a lot of problems with the statement. They're also saying that it will have limited climate impact along the length of the pipeline, which sort of misses the point, since what we're worried about is the carbon that it will release, not to mention the possibility of it actually leaking. So at this point, we are now in a 90-day comment period where other departments of the government will be commenting on it, and the public comment period will start February 5th, so you'll all have a chance to write something about it. And when that 90-day period is up, Secretary of State Kerry will make a recommendation to President Obama, and then President Obama will make a decision about it. So 76,000 Americans and counting have signed the Pledge of Resistance. The Pledge of Resistance is people who are pledging to commit civil disobedience in order to try to stop President Obama from approving it. So if at the end of the 90-day period the recommendation is made to him that he should approve it, then you will be seeing a lot of people getting arrested, hoping to really drive home the message to President Obama that we won't stand for this. We have also been dogging him everywhere he goes for the last several years, so whenever he goes somewhere, there's people standing with signs saying no on XL, and in this sign here you can also see that it says Stop TPP. This is, as you know, President Obama was here this past November, and this is our local chapter greeting him when he was here in November, and he did see us. Many of you are probably aware of the very successful work of Power Past Coal, a coalition of environmental groups working against coal trains. And I have to say, we've made great progress. Originally, there were 5 proposals for shipping coal from Montana to Washington ports. Several of them canceled. At this point, the one at Cherry Point is on the verge of collapsing. One of the major funders has pulled their money out of it. There's a lawsuit against it. The local board there has been elected with a majority of people against it. So that one is probably going to go down. And that leaves only one viable proposal to ship out of the port of Vancouver by Longview, Washington. This happened because thousands of Washingtonians came out and testified against the coal trains at several different hearings that were held. So this, in my mind, is really a story of successful citizen activism. The Northwest is very fortunate because Seattle City Light gets most of its energy from hydropower, and we have a better carbon footprint than most of the country. However, Puget Sound Energy still gets a significant part of its energy from dirty coal in Montana, and so we have to keep the pressure up on them to get out of the coal business. A critical thing to understand is that right now Washington is at risk for becoming a carbon corridor. Not only have they been trying to ship the coal across our state, but now they are also shipping fracked Bakken shale to market across our state. And there are proposals for 10 oil-to-rail new proposals. So there's going to be a lot of hearings coming up in the next 2 years about those proposals. These trains, they're very old cars. They're prone to puncture. And it's been discovered that the shale, because it is extracted from fairly deep in the earth, has a lot of explosive gases in it as part of it. And so on the trains, if it gets above 73 degrees, there's a very high chance of it exploding. And so we've already had 6 explosions since July of last year. And in one case, 47 people in a whole town were wiped out. So this is why we are doing things like we just met this week with the new mayor's staff, trying to make the case to him to stand in opposition to it. And 13 different environmental groups have sent a letter to Governor Inslee asking him to put a moratorium on this until it can get better sorted out. We also have divestment as an important part of the strategy of 350. We've called for cities, universities, and churches to divest their share of fossil fuel industries, to not have stock in them. And this is because the fossil fuel industry owns 5 times the reserves of what can be safely burned. So we want to put moral pressure on them to say that this is not acceptable to make profit at the cost of human life. This is not unlike the divestment process that happened around South Africa, where a lot of pressure was put on the South African government to end apartheid. And just as in that campaign, you don't have to have even a huge percentage of people divesting. You just have to have people divesting, because it starts that process and that attention to the issue. Mayor McGinn became the first mayor in this country to pledge divestment of Seattle, and he divested our general fund. Most of the money, however, is in the Employee Retirement Fund, so we are currently engaging in a campaign to get City Council to put pressure on the board overseeing the pension to divest. And if there are any city employees in the audience, I'd love to hear from you later. You can also sign our petition, which is on our webpage about this. The UW and Seattle U students are also actively engaged in campaigns to get their campuses to divest, and I think are making some good progress on that. The Unitarian Church and the Presbyterian Church have also, on a regional level, begun the divestment of their funds. We in the Northwest still need to be developing alternative sources of energy. We are lucky because we have this possibility for solar fields and wind fields in eastern Washington, and this is a picture of some of the wind fields that we do have in eastern Washington. In 2011, we had an extra large snowmelt, the opposite of what we'll have this year, and it was maxing out the grid because of the hydropower, and so then they started asking the windmills to unhook from it because the grid couldn't take any more capacity, and that then puts the windmills at risk for financial failure. So one of the things we have to do is build grid capacity so that the alternatives can actually do their job. We are also many decades behind other major cities in having good public transportation, so we have to keep pushing on that front as well. In September 2010, City Council passed an initiative to make Seattle carbon neutral, making it one of their 6 priorities for the city and all the other laws and policies that they pass. Seattle now has such a plan to get to carbon neutral by 2050. I have to say it's a very inadequate plan. It doesn't move us nearly fast enough. Most of the changes at the end. It is a start, and again, we have to keep pushing. In Washington, during the 2013 legislative season, we passed a program called New Energy Cities, which was to help moderate-sized cities in our state make their own plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's kind of cool because that's moving that same model to other cities. So there's sort of a hope there that some of them can start to plan and look in the right direction. Another great way to take action is to join your local Scallops group. Scallops stands for Sustainable Communities All Over Puget Sound. And if you go to scallops.ning.com, you can find the one closest to you. They try to work on helping build sustainable neighborhoods and getting people in neighborhoods to cooperate with each other on sustainable alternatives. So this is billed as a non-depressing talk on climate change. Some of you will feel like it lived up to its title, some of you will not. I've tried to show in this talk that we have all the solutions we need, we just need the political will. I've tried to show how the misinformation campaigns have affected us, and I've tried to show how you can work on your own personal carbon footprint as well as how you can join with others on working on climate change. Joanna Macy says, when a change wants to happen, it looks for people to act through. How do we know when a change wants to happen? We feel the want inside us. When we see with new eyes, we recognize how every action has significance, how the bigger story of the Great Turning is made up of countless smaller stories. If you were freed from fear and doubt, what would you do for the Great Turning of our society? Joanna Macy is an ecofeminist, a Buddhist, and a whole systems thinker who's been working since the early 80s on helping people to notice how our despair for the state of the earth sits on us and immobilizes us. Her workshops, The Work That Reconnect, she covers the spiral: gratitude, grief for the world, seeing with new eyes, which is about nonlinear time, and going forth, which is about action steps. My own despair about climate change has been greatly changed by doing this work. And I have to say, the more I've moved into activism, the more my despair has lifted. So I closed with that quote from Joanna and the news that we do have a local Work That Reconnects group that meets once a month, and also the information of her book, Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. Because if you are feeling discouraged about climate change, there is a hopeful way forward. So I heard a couple different groups sort of looking at the question of, is there enough time to make change? And just, you know, in general, how slowly human beings make change. And certainly, like, if I think about things like the 150 years it took to end slavery in the United States, I can kind of, you know, pull my hair out and say, oh God, you know, we're sunk. However, the example that I would rather draw our attention to is World War II. Because during World War II, in this country, when this country decided that it was a crisis, we put rations on various different things. People didn't drive. The whole industry of this country was transformed to producing for the war effort. People did without all kinds of things in order for that production for the war effort to happen. People had victory gardens. Most homes garden and produce some of their food. And this was all in a relatively short period of time, a year or two, that this change took place. And at the same time, you had people throughout Europe and Russia and Japan also living in kind of crisis conditions, their lives totally turned upside down, living completely differently. Really, if you think about it, South America was the only continent that wasn't affected by World War II. So we have in our history a time where we as a people came together and made changes towards a common goal. If we had the political leadership, and that will only be created by the pressure from us, we could galvanize in this same sort of way. But it really is going to be needing to galvanize. Just doing little incremental things is not going to do it. Yeah, Rich. This is at least the second time I know that there's been a pledge of resistance. There was also one in the 80s where people had pledged to, the idea was to try to prevent the next Vietnam War. And we saw the U.S. government really doing a lot of bad CIA action in Central America and looking like they were going to invade various countries in Central America. And so people pledged and said, I will come and I will commit civil disobedience at a key moment to try to stop a U.S. invasion. And, you know, we didn't invade any of those countries. I don't know if I really want to count that given what the CIA did, but arguably that was effective. And so this is a kind of similar idea of, can we strategically commit civil disobedience at a key moment that will put pressure on President Obama? So would seeing 76,000 people get arrested in every major city in the United States make him feel like it would be untenable to go forward, that this would be, you know, the kind of civil unrest that he would be facing? So that's kind of the idea behind the Pledge of Resistance. And if people are interested in that, there are ongoing civil disobedience trainings for participating in it. You, in fact, can't participate in it unless you first go to the training. And there's one coming up in February. I forget the exact date, but it is on our website. And I should also mention that 350seattle.org's website has an action page on it, and that's kept very current. And so at any moment in time, if you look at it and are kind of trying to figure out what are some actions that you could take, there are always some on there. There is a woman who is active with Earth Ministries who's one of the people helping to organize the civil disobedience trainings. Certainly Earth Ministry is aware of them, but I wouldn't say that they themselves are doing active organizing around it. 350 did have a work group which was on church divestment, and that one kind of folded into our general divestment group at this point. But we are actively looking at How can we do more outreach with churches? So we have a speakers bureau, of which I'm one of the speakers, trying to go out to the churches and then really wanting to talk to the churches specifically about divestment, so each church can start to look at how can they work with their denomination on divesting. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why 350 locally has endorsed WA Amend, the attempt to get a amendment to the Constitution that would name that corporations are not people. As long as we still have this on the books, that corporations are given the legal standing of people, then the amount of money that they are pouring into politics is just controlling politics, and they're also doing things like, you know, the oil trains that have started going, that I was showing how dangerous they were. You know, they didn't ask anybody. The regulations had never foreseen a possibility of shipping explosive gases on rail. They just started doing it, you know, because they're corporations and they kind of rule right now. And the politicians are all looking around at each other right now like, oh dear, like this really scares me. This is, you know, and I feel like they're looking around to see where the grown-up in the room is. You know, like they're thinking some grown-up somewhere is going to come in and say, you know, don't do this. And apparently we're going to have to be the grown-ups in the room, and, you know, we're going to have to, like, put enough pressure on Governor Inslee that he call a moratorium. And he does have the power. He could do it. But he's going to have to feel public pressure to do it. He's not going to, you know, have all the oil companies gunning for him if he just takes that action by himself. He has to at least be able to say, you know, there was a mass uprising of people demanding this. So, yeah. Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to the previous gentleman's question. I mean, the oil companies have the money, so not surprisingly, you know, they give the big salaries and this sort of thing. Heaven knows that we could have engineers working on any number of problems having to do with passive solar design, making more integrative design in buildings, working on the alternative energies applications to other things, but that it's completely underfunded. You know, we're giving the subsidies still to oil and coal, and we're not giving the subsidies to really the development of alternatives. If we were pouring money into the development of alternatives, there would absolutely be well-paying jobs for bright minds to be figuring these things out. So we're still working in that disadvantage of having the corporations having all the power and being motivated by their own profit. Yeah, there's an interesting sort of irony for me around the fact that the military, in doing their kind of planning process, it sees these problems and then starts working on alternative solutions. Like, they actually recognize that it would be a military disaster for them to not be able to have a sustainable way of supporting the troops. So, you know, they're starting to move in that direction, and yet they're not going to be very public about it because they're not going to undermine the powers that be in our country. They're not going to undermine the oil and coal companies. So they're just sort of quietly doing it off there on the side. I think we have to give up the notion that the next generation will be the ones to solve the problem, because I think that is a way that we as adults sort of stop taking responsibility for the situation. The reality is that everyone in this room will be affected by climate change, and so you know, it's our future too. It's our old age. It's what life is going to look like in the next 2 decades, and so, you know, we have to start taking pretty radical actions. I mean, the reason I was using the World War II analogy is because that was a radical transformation of what people's lifestyle was like, and we are going to have to get radical. You know, that is the really interesting thing about climate change. You can't buy your way out. I mean, you know, nuclear war, people made their little, you know, shelters in their home and stuff. There was this fantasy that you could buy a solution out of Holocaust. And there's no bought solution out of climate change. You know, there won't be a corner of the earth that won't be too hot. There just isn't a way to have your little safe corner. And he certainly, by being president, has access to a lot of information the rest of us don't have access to. I think he's very clear about the dangers and what his children's lifetime will look like. So I'm not saying that he won't say yes to it. I think there's a very high possibility he will, because his actions have been so flip-floppy, and you know, he says yes to one thing and no to the next thing, and he's gone back and forth on this. So frankly, to me, it's a flip of a coin right now whether he'll say yes or no. But your question was, what might possibly motivate him to say no to it? And I think it would be what he knows himself and his two daughters. It will also be a mass movement. I mean, he will have to say, I couldn't say yes. The people were rising up in the streets. I couldn't say yes. And he has actually hinted and alluded to that in various speeches before. He has sort of said, make me say no, you know. So, I mean, that is why the Pledge of Resistance is there. You know, we're trying to give him the backing to say no. Now, whether he'll take the backing, I don't know, but we're trying. Pardon? No, it's before he makes the decision. It's in a very short window where he can't make the decision today. He has to wait for the environmental review comment period to be over. So it's in the very short window after when he can act and before he does. So there may be actually a week where there will just be civil disobedience happening every day in various cities. And watch for it this week, because there are going to be 3 actions this week in reaction to last Friday. Of course, the media is not very good at covering this, so you may actually have to Google it in order to find it, but there will be 3 actions this week. I would Google something like Pledge of Resistance action, or, you know, the date. I don't know. I don't know yet if we'll put it up on the website. That's maybe a good idea that we should put that up there. Joanna Macy talks about 3 ways we make the great turning, and the great turning is her way of talking about coming back to a place of health. She says one of them is Band-Aid actions. Those are the actions we take to stop coal trains and oil trains and whatever the newest form of destroying life is. The other is alternative institutions. So, you know, when you start a company that's making windmills or something, you're making an alternative institution. And the other is new vision, you know, where we figure out and we see, you know, what are the ways we can do things, we come up with new ideas, etc. And she says we have to have all 3. And I think that one of the great killers in movements is we wind up arguing about, you know, oh, we should do this instead of that, or this is the way to do it and that way is not the way to do it, and we sort of tear at each other while we're being upset about the oppressive society and the ways in which things are being made into a mess. So, you know, I just say choose, you know, choose what will get you moving and do one of them, because we do need some more elbows in there.